Welcome to a presentation of the National Mass Violence Center's SNAPS mini-webinar series. We are grateful to the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime for its cooperative agreement that supports our center's programs and services. The opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of the National Mass Violence Center and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. In this SNAPS, we will discuss the value of shared language across the mass violence continuum that reflects and respects what we have learned from mass violence victims, survivors, and those who serve them. I'm Ann Seymour, the Center's Associate Academic Program Director, and I'm so pleased to be able to share some insights with you through this SNAPS webinar. We have two learning objectives we hope to achieve. You'll be able to identify words or phrases that some mass violence victims and survivors may find insensitive or hurtful, and then you'll be able to describe words or phrases that can be used instead. The content of this SNAPS reflects important lessons we have learned over many years of assisting mass violence victims and survivors, especially from those very victims and survivors. Perhaps most importantly, we've learned that sensitivity to the language we use in the aftermath of mass violence incidents can have a positive impact on anyone who is impacted by mass violence. A very powerful quotation from Archbishop Desmond Tutu offers the perfect framework for this SNAPS. He said, "Language is very powerful. Language does not just describe reality, language creates the reality it describes." If we can create a reality for mass violence victims, survivors, first responders, and entire impacted communities that features collective sensitivity to the language we all use, we are less likely to cause undue trauma to those whom we seek to serve. So, this SNAPS will specifically discuss 6 words and phrases that can be hurtful to victims and survivors, and for 5 out of those 6, we offer options for victim-sensitive and trauma-informed language to consider using instead. For years, the initial response center following a mass violence incident has been called a reunification center. We have learned from countless victims and survivors whose loved ones were killed in the mass violence incident and those who served them that the term reunification sets up false expectations for those who will never be reunified with their loved ones who were murdered. After lengthy discussions that involved seeking input from our entire field, a federal working group of national leaders in mass violence response, including our center, reached a consensus that the phrase "friends and relatives center" is an appropriate description of the initial response center based upon who is served there. Many victims and survivors do not like the term anniversary, which connotes a joyous event to be annually celebrated, whereas the observance of a mass violence incident is very solemn, often very painful, and a serious occasion for victims, for survivors, and for entire communities. The terms annual commemoration or annual observance can be used interchangeably to describe these important memorial events. The word trigger in itself can be traumatic to victims, survivors, and their loved ones who were victims of gunshots during the mass violence incident or at any time in their lives. The research literature widely uses the term trauma cues, which can be both internal cues and external cues. And we have a tip sheet that describes internal and external trauma cues related to mass violence incidents that you can access through the URL link featured here. The news media and others often report on or describe the number of people who are injured in a mass violence incident or the number of injuries. In reality, the scope of injuries for mass violence victims and survivors is quite broad, including injuries that are physical, psychological or emotional, behavioral, financial, social, and spiritual. When addressing or reporting about injuries that are physical, it's helpful to clarify instead physical injuries or physically injured. At the National Mass Violence Center, we're often asked if those directly impacted by mass violence incidents should be called victims or survivors. In reality, there is no should. Rather, it's very important to respect and reflect an individual's preferred terminology and specifically ask if they have a preference. It's also important to note that federal and state laws overwhelmingly use the term victim to connote somebody who has been harmed by crime. So in cases involving criminal justice proceedings, the statutes guide the term that is used, and that term is victim. But until you know someone's stated preference, it's a good idea to say victims and survivors or victims survivors. And once you know a personal preference, that is the term to use. Closure signals the end of something that you are able to conclude or complete. It is a widely used term after a mass violence incident occurs, as well-intentioned people often seek a sense of finality to the horror and trauma of a mass violence incident. I personally learned to never again use this term from a survivor of the Oklahoma City bombing of the Federal Murrah building in 1995, whose son was murdered in this terrorist attack. She said, "You close on a house, you never close on your son's life." And a survivor of a child's death has this to say about closure: there is no such thing. We never close this part of our life, the part of losing a child. It molds us forever. So there is no word to be offered instead, but rather that consideration be given to not ever use the word closure, that for many mass violence victims and survivors is an impossibility. So let's check back in on this SNAP's learning objectives. Did we identify words or phrases that some victims and survivors may find insensitive and hurtful? And did we describe words or phrases that can be used instead? You can let us know if our learning objectives were met by taking a photo of the QR code on this slide, which will take you to a brief anonymous survey to assess this SNAP's webinar. You can also provide us with suggestions for additional SNAP's webinars, which we always appreciate. Thank you so much for completing this survey, and especially thank you for participating in this SNAP's webinar about shared language across the mass violence continuum.